When stakeholders question your timeline, it usually happens in a meeting. Someone looks at the schedule. They pause. Then they ask a question that sounds simple. Why is this taking so long? Or sometimes it's phrased slightly different. Can we move this date up? Now, many project managers respond by explaining the schedule in detail. They walk through dependencies. They list the blockers. They explain why the timeline exists. And the intention is good. They are trying to show that the timeline is logical. However, that response often weakens their position in the room because the conversation shifts from decision management to explanation. And when explanation becomes the focus, confidence in the timeline quietly drops. Strong project managers handle this moment differently. Instead of defending the timeline, they reset the conversation around impact. For example, imagine a stakeholder asks, "Can we launch this 2 weeks earlier?" Instead of immediately explaining why that may be difficult, a stronger response might sound like this. If we move the date earlier, the main impact would be testing coverage. That's the area that would change first. Notice what happened there. The conversation moved from defending the schedule to clarifying consequences. That shift matters because stakeholders don't actually want the entire timeline explained. They want to understand the trade-offs. Now, let's look at another example. A stakeholder says, "This timeline feels long." Again, many project managers respond with a detailed explanation of every task involved. But that explanation can feel like justification. A stronger response could be, "The timeline is mainly driven by the integration phase. That's where most of the schedule sits." Now the conversation has direction. You've highlighted the factor that actually controls the timeline. And stakeholders can respond to that information. They may ask if the integration can be simplified. They may ask if resources can be added. But the discussion stays structured. Now, let's talk about why this matters. Stakeholders rarely question timelines because they want project managers to defend themselves. They question timelines because they want clarity about constraints. What drives the schedule? What would change if the schedule changed? What risks appear if speed increases? When project managers respond by explaining everything, those signals get buried. So, here is a useful structure you can use the next time your timeline is challenged. First, identify the driver. What part of the project actually determines the timeline? Second, explain the impact of change. If the schedule moves, what is the first area affected? Testing, integration, quality, scope. Third, pause. Do not continue expanding unless the stakeholder asks for more information. This structure keeps the conversation focused on decisions rather than explanations. Now, there is another important point here. Stakeholder questions about timelines are normal. They are not necessarily a sign that your project is in trouble. They are often part of how stakeholders explore options. However, when the project manager reacts defensively, those questions start to feel like pressure. And the room begins to read uncertainty. So the goal is not to eliminate timeline questions. The goal is to handle them calmly and structurally. When you identify the driver of the schedule and explain the impact of change, the conversation becomes much clearer. Stakeholders understand the logic, and you maintain influence in the discussion. So, the next time someone asks, "Can we move this timeline up?" avoid the instinct to explain the entire project plan. Instead, identify the schedule driver, explain the impact of change, and then allow the conversation to move forward from there. That small shift changes how stakeholders experience your leadership in the room. And it keeps the discussion focused on decisions instead of defense. If this is a situation that you encounter often, the next episode explains what to do when stakeholder oversight increases and project managers start losing influence.